Hello, and welcome to episode 18 of Design Curious Podcast. I'm Rebecca Ward, your host and mentor. Today we have an interview with Bethany Reed of Atelier Reed. And before we get into a little more about Bethany, I wanted to remind you only have a few days left before the prices go up in My Design Mentor. Right now it's less than $1 a day, but that will be going up January 1st, so I want you to get in there. And then if you do, before the end of the year, you'll have access to those 30-minute bonus calls with me. So I really hope you take advantage of that this week, and I'd love to see you in My Design Mentor and just be able to help you discover if interior design is the career for you. All right, so now a little bit about Bethany. You'll love her story. She is an interior designer, but she's also, let me just read her bio for you. Bethany Reed Peterson is an interior designer turned podcast and messaging coach. She helps interior designers and personal brands find their voice to become more profitable, lead with confidence, and cultivate greater meaning in their work. Bethany launched her design and self-development podcast, Arrived, in 2019, initially to help her then niche single men find their voice at home and in their relationships. In 2020, shortly after the first pandemic lockdown temporarily shuttered the interior design industry, Bethany received multiple requests from peers to help them launch their own podcast. It was then that she realized a narrative more closely aligned with her own story needed to feature in her podcast and coaching. She is the creator of Find Your Voice, an online course and membership community to help creatives rediscover their why, find their voice, and launch their podcast in 8 short weeks. Bethany's own voice and work have been featured in The Guardian, Wallpaper, Architectural Digest, The Course Method, OnlineCourseTalks.com, A Well-Designed Business with Leland Niagara, I Am CEO, Subkit, and Minnesota AM 950 Radio. Her podcasts, Arrived and Arrived Daily, have been streamed in 25 countries. So let's hear from Bethany all about her story, which is really fascinating. So let's get into it. You're now listening to Design Curious, a place where you, creative one, are here to learn about what it really is like to be an interior designer. And I'm your host and mentor, Rebecca Ward. If you're worried about how to succeed in a creative career, if you're ready to learn your next steps to become an interior designer, and if you want the satisfaction of doing something you love every day, you are in the right place. Grab a coffee, a notebook, and let's dig into today's episode. Hi, Bethany. Welcome to Design Curious Podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me on the show, Rebecca. It's so good to see your face after long.
I know.
I suppose no one's on video right now other than you and me, but
yeah.
If you've not seen Rebecca's beautiful face, of course you have, but so lovely to see you. Thank you for having me on the show.
Yeah. Thanks, Bethany. And honestly, I have to tell everyone this podcast wouldn't be here without you because of your great course you have on podcasts, but we'll get into that later. So first of all, we met because you're an interior designer.
I am.
And so let's talk about that. How did you get started in interior design? And did you always want to be a designer?
Yeah. So I'll do the Cliff's Notes version on this because my story, and hopefully this will resonate with your listeners, because I think a lot of your listeners are maybe thinking about going to design school, or maybe they're switching into a second career. I had a very conventional, but also an unconventional route into interior design. I initially started in fashion design when I was going to school at the University of San Francisco. And then there was a cross collaboration with, I think at that time, I think they've now rebranded, but it was called California College of the Arts, or it was like CCAD. Anyway, they had a fashion program, and I was also at USF. And so I initially thought I was going to be doing fashion, but then realized that, I mean, because like you and like so many of your listeners, I'm quite sure I was also that person that as the child, I would, rearrange my room and I would paint the walls all the time, like much to my parents' chagrin. And, I would just I always had this design bug in me. And so I think the interior design bug won out over the fashion design bug. But that said, I actually quit design school, not once, but twice.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, I know. Right. So I didn't actually finish up a bachelor's in interior design. I actually wound up getting my bachelor's in NYU for gender studies and film studies. So like not entirely not creative by any means, but just not, hands-on design as it were. When I had finished that program, I still missed interior design.
Yeah.
And, loved what I was studying prior, but was like, oh man, maybe I should go back into interior design. So I enrolled at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn it was called interior design. It was a master's in interior design, but I think really the program should have been called Masters in Interior Architecture, which to someone you and I know the huge differences of that. But to someone who's, not as informed on that, interior architecture is a very, very different thing than, let's say, for example, like what you might see on HGTV, where someone is not necessarily like knocking out walls or whatever. They're doing more of like the decoration and design in the industry. We call it FF&E, standing for finishes, fixtures, and equipment, or furnishings, fixtures, and equipment. That whole aspect of interior design was what was appealing to me.
Mm-hmm.
And the Pratt program was rigorous and amazing, and all the professors were exceptional, but it just wasn't for me.
Yeah.
But I didn't give up at that point yet on interior design and my education within it. I actually then transferred to the Parsons School of Design in Manhattan, which was a post-baccalaureate associate's degree, 2 years associate's degree in interior design. So it was for people who had already had a bachelor's but didn't want to do a master's in interior design. Did a semester there, loved it, but just was like, I think I want to go back to school and do a master's in art history. Like, I just don't know if I want the hands-on. I think I love the theoretical within design, but I don't know if I love the hands-on.
Okay.
So I went off to the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, did a master's in art history, and then moved down to London. And Cal Surprise then wound up working for an interior design studio called Studio Reed. So that's really, I would say, how I got my start in interior design, or what I should say too is actually I did an internship at David Collins Studio, which is another high-end residential and hospitality studio in London. So those two places are really, really where I cut my teeth.
Yeah.
So I actually never finished a design degree. So I think, first thing I would say is for like anyone who's like, I have to go to design school, or how am I going to go to design school? I can't afford it, but I really want to be an interior designer.
Right.
You absolutely do not need to have a degree. I would say that, I did 2 internships at both places, which is then how I wound up getting my first role at Studio Reed as a junior designer. So I did like a 3-month, and it was unpaid. And I would never say to someone, do an unpaid role. I don't even think you can offer unpaid roles anymore, but like back in the day, you could. So I started as a junior designer, and I was working on this really large estate project out in the Surrey Hills. And I was very fortunate in the respect that I didn't have to do any CAD drawings. I didn't have to do a lot of the technical, or have like a lot of that technical knowledge that you would have learned had you completed your design degree. So that said, I would never also say you don't need drawing skills. I think you absolutely need drawing skills. I just really lucked into a studio that was 40 strong and was very, not assembly line, but they had a whole team that just did CAD drawings.
Right.
And they had a whole team that just did the FF&E, like I was mentioning. And that's the side that I was on. So thankfully I got to use some of the more historical knowledge that I had acquired from the master's in art history, as well as the previous design knowledge that I had acquired through previous design education, and then combine those two into a role. And so that's really where I think my experience and my true education came from, was just diving in and working at a design studio and being really humble and asking questions and holding my hand up and saying like, I don't know what you're talking about. Like, what does that mean?
Yeah.
And then just trusting that people will take pity on you and say, oh, this term means this, or, when you go pick up fabrics at the studio, this is who you have to ask for. This is what you have to, know in order to do X, Y, and Z. So that's how I got I would say my start in interior design, and then really the knowledge that I did acquire over the years. Because I wound up working for Studio Reed for a couple of years before that my visa was running out, and it was still like recession. It was like in 2010 to 2012. And so, the studio was just not in a position to be able to take like, people who had to like get a visa to do that kind of thing. It was a whole mess kind of like with visa situations, which is a whole other story.
Oh yeah.
But it was an amazing education, and I learned from some of the very best in the industry. and I wouldn't trade it for the world. And it was also grueling on a level that it was like Devil's Wears Prada. So
Oh
we
no.
can get into that, at a different point, but it was
Oh.
wonderful.
Yeah.
So that's how I got my start, right? Like it was a very roundabout stop start. Think I'm going to get out of it. No, I want to get back into it. Maybe I should just test the waters in real life and see how I like it.
Yeah. You kept landing there, even though you try to go up like art history major, all that, but it's just you kept coming back to it, huh?
I did. And the thing is, too, is that all of these things that I did study were so applicable, like even the gender studies and film studies. So even though I was working on more on the theoretical versus like filmmaking, all of these things that you learn can be applied because design is such an all-encompassing industry. We have to be psychologists to our clients sometimes. We have to have a technical skill set. We have to know how to read a situation and know how to read a room. I mean, all of these things that you learn, no matter what field you're coming from. Maybe you're a CPA right now and you want to transition into something that's more creative. Well, you have to have that skill set as well if you want to become an interior designer. So, anywhere you're coming from, I would say if you're thinking about, getting into interior design, like don't ever worry that you haven't had the right background.
Yeah, because all of life experiences will come into play as you're doing your design. Because even for me, I always went through, I was very traditional. I went through a design. I didn't really work in any other industries, but just my own life experiences now are coming into play being a mother and owning a house and all those things. I
Yes.
am experiencing what my clients are going through, and they love that I can relate to that as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's something that's so important. And you actually, I was planning on kind of talking about this a little bit later, but you brought it up now. And I think one aspect of being a great designer is really knowing your client and anticipating their needs. And
Hmm.
because I suppose you work with a lot of clients that are parents or are mothers. And now that you are a mother yourself, you can read that client in a way that I'm not a mother. Like I wouldn't be able to anticipate their needs in a
Hmm.
way that you can because you have that real world knowledge.
Hmm. Yeah. So what experiences then played into the direction that you went with your career? So you ended up starting your own company, right? So how did you transition to that?
Yeah. So after I left Studio Reed in London, I went on and did an MBA in architectural management, which is the weirdest thing, right? So here's this person who doesn't even have a design degree, but I somehow got an MBA in architectural management and advanced design principles, which was crazy. Like I still don't know how I have that degree, but somehow I have it, right? And I would say though, actually, because that was so business focused,
Mm,
so business heavy, it was a lot of what a traditional MBA would be, but it was tailored for those in the design industry, including architects. So,
interesting.
yeah, I know it's kind of crazy. I still look back at a lot of the things that I was taught in that program. And, I'm using it today in what I'm doing now as a podcast coach, even though it has nothing to do with interior design per se. After that, I wound up moving back to the United States. Again, the old visa issues was, I love the UK, but the UK just does not always love me. um, but so I wound up moving back to the United States shortly after that, maybe about a year after I concluded that program, and wound up working for two different design studios here in Minneapolis, where I'm now located. Again, learned so much about, much more boots to the ground, I think, on how to run a business because these were much smaller firms. They were 2 to 3 person studios versus, like I'd said prior, I was working at a 40 strong studio.
Yeah.
So I had a much greater knowledge of what it meant to run a day-to-day business in interiors. And I got to this point where I thought, I think I was like 30, maybe 33 at that point. And I just got to this point where I was like, I want to try this entrepreneurship thing. And I had done a foray into that when I was living in London, doing the MBA and something different, not in interior design, ironically or not. I thought, like, let's try this. But I think I want to do this a little bit differently than what I have been or what my experience with other studios has been. And so
Hmm.
I got into consulting work for single men, as a matter of fact. Because one thing I should probably have rewound on is when I was still at Studio Reed in London, in my late 20s, I would moonlight as a designer And I wound up working with a lot of single men at the time. So my neighbor was this single guy who's like looking for love. And, then he had a couple friends who were like, oh, well, I need my place done. So I didn't really do like bachelor pad design, so to speak, but I was helping these guys when I was living in London and also working at Reed. So when it came to running my own studio, I thought, well, what was I doing before? What did I really like doing? I liked having this component of, I guess, coaching as well as consulting. So I started my studio, Atelier Reed, for single men who were at a life transition. So maybe they'd had a divorce, or maybe they were looking for that life partner, whoever it might be. Really enjoyed doing that and working with them. But at this point in my life, unlike when I was, sort of 27, 30 and single and in London myself, right? Like, again, talking about anticipating your client's needs, being in that headspace, I was now living in Minneapolis. I was married and suddenly trying to help guys via Zoom, right, on these design consults that maybe lived in a totally different country. And I found it much more difficult to anticipate their needs. I felt like I was doing a lot of research to try to like get into their headspace.
Oh, okay. Whereas prior you were already in, because you were single like they were when you were initially doing it. So you kind of had that headspace. I think you were, approaching things the same way that they were at a similar place in life as they were. So it's easier to get into their head, basically.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. This is like dating me, but when I got married, I don't even think like Bumble was I didn't even know what Bumble was. Like, I don't even think it was around when so it's like there were so many things that like I'd never been on Tinder. Like there were so many things that like I didn't know because I hadn't had to like worry about what it felt like to go on a first date in a really long time.
Yeah.
So whilst I was still doing this, I actually did what you're doing now. Is I started a podcast to reach out to listeners out there, single men specifically, who might not know who I was, but to help not only, of course, to market the business, but really to help people out there who maybe, let's say, they had no idea where to begin on their own space, or they hadn't even thought about it. Because let's face it, like, men are not taught in the same way that women are taught to think about nurturing their space and their environment. So I started this podcast called Arrived for these guys because it was all about helping men feel like they've arrived at home and in their relationships. I loved the podcast. I had a great time doing that. But again, it felt like, man, every episode, like, what am I going to talk about now? I have to read another article in GQ to like figure this out. So when the pandemic hit and the whole industry was temporarily shuttered, because of course, no one was letting anyone into their homes, the whole industry just shut down. I actually wound up having a couple of peers reach out to me to say, hey, you know what? I think I need to pivot a little bit in my marketing because everything is topsy-turvy right now. Could you help me start my podcast for my design business? I really like what you're doing.
Yeah.
And at first I was like, well, I just cobbled this whole thing together, like via YouTube videos and, like product demos that I had seen, right? Like I had no idea what I was doing with podcasting, or so I thought. But I also wanted to help my friends out who had reached out to me, and these other people that I had known who had reached out. And so I was like, okay, well, let's give it a shot, right? Like my thought was, if it's the worst experience that these people have ever had, then I'll just give them their money back and no harm, no foul. And it'll be a learning experience for us both.
Yeah.
But it snowballed in a way. And I wound up, actually transitioning completely away from interior design now into podcast coaching, mostly for interior designers who tend to be married women like in their 40s.
Okay.
So people like me now. So there you go. So I'm totally full circle.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that's so interesting. You've heard it said where you are actually your own client type of thing, but it's true because you know so much about yourself, what your own needs are, that you can really understand the people that you're trying to help if they are in a similar demographic. Really interesting. So, okay, so you moved away from, so are you just not taking design jobs, or did you completely shutter the studio, or?
I decided that I was having too much fun consulting with my podcast students to then want to go back into interior design, even on a consultative basis. So I was actually having a lot of fun on a consultative basis. And that's something I should mention too, is I think when we think of interior design, a lot of times what we do think of is the traditional design studio space.
Yeah.
So kind of like the studios that I was talking
yeah.
about. Full service design, concept to completion, but there's so many different ways to get into design, including consultation, where you're taking your client and, you know, you're not actually performing the work for them in full service design. You're actually showing them how to do it. I think that was a good first step into me then becoming a podcast coach as well, because I love the consulting process. But I just got to this point where I realized that even though I still continue to miss interior design on some levels, right? Like when I walk into a restaurant and it's just like beautifully designed, there's always a part of me that's like, oh, I bet it was so fun to design this. And then there's another part of me that's like, no, I know the reality of what it took and the graft and the work and the long nights and the blood, sweat, and tears that went into designing this space. And there's that part of me that's like, man, I don't miss that. Like, I don't miss the headache of that. And I don't want to sound like a downer on the industry at all, because it's amazing. It's magic. Like what we get to do as designers, it's alchemy. But I also realized that for me, it also came down to, I wanted to be able to help people on a scale that I didn't feel like I could help them on, which is just in my own headspace, right? So I was like, well, I could help one client with their home, but if I can work with another client, like such as yourself, Rebecca, where now you have a podcast and now you get to spread your message to so many listeners out there. So when I look at that personally, I'm like, that's what's really exciting to me now, because I feel like I get to do something at such a greater scale.
Yeah.
You could say the same thing though about interior design. So it's all about how you choose to look at it. I just got to this point where I was like, man, I'm having too much fun with this podcast stuff to go back into design.
Well, yeah. And you need to, I mean, ultimately, you need to be doing what lights you up every day. When you get up in the morning, you're like, yes, it's Monday morning and I'm excited to get to work because I love what I'm doing. Now, granted, not every single week's going to feel that way, but if majority of the time you do feel that way, then you know you're doing the right thing. And so, yeah, I was going to talk about this later, but like you seem to be the queen of pivoting and transitioning from one thing in your life to the next. What's your mindset around that as you were approaching all of these pivots in your life? If someone else finds themselves in a similar situation, do you have a recommendation for them to have the right mindset around that?
Yeah, I think really it just comes down to, I think the second we tell ourselves we have to start over, or I might be starting from scratch, right? So let's go back to that example of the CPA, the accountant, right? That person might think, well, I have no creative skill set, or I'd have to start over, right? Well, if you want to start your own studio, or if you even want to work in a studio, having that knowledge is only going to help you and further you. You know, you might have studied Romance languages before, or, you know, I've known maybe you were working as a translator for, you know, diplomats or whatever it might be. I'm trying to think of really obscure examples here. Actually, I have a friend who's a translator that does just that. But it's like everything that you have done to this day, you can bring into the field of interior design, because like we were saying, it is so all-encompassing. It is about, at the end of the day, I think, relationships just as much as it's about that final product. It's about relationships with your suppliers, your tradespeople, the client, all of these different things. So I think the biggest thing I would say is, yeah, I mean, if you're going to make a pivot, just really own it, and just remember that you can take anything that you have had, that you've learned in the past, and use that as an asset, not a liability. And actually, as a matter of fact, those are the kind of things that I would be talking about, like in a covering letter, for example. So if you're applying to a studio and you have a completely different skill set, right?
Yeah.
You'd want to go through and say like, well, in my previous role, I did this, and this is how I can translate it into this role. So really like joining the dots for a hiring manager, let's say, or an HR professional. I'm getting a bit like granular on it now, but it's just, I think, really about thinking, hey, I've got this knowledge, whatever it is, even if it's not in design, and I can translate this into something else, and I can pivot and I can do it beautifully.
So good. That's really great advice. I love that. Okay. So the podcast that you're doing now, you're actually still in the design world though, because you're working with interior designers. So I think that's interesting that you're still landing in interior design, even though now you're podcasting. So,
right.
Yeah. So is that scratching that itch for you as like your baseline of wanting to be a designer?
Yeah, it's funny because I was thinking about like one of the things that I would also say to listeners too, it's like find out why it is you like. What is it that you love about interior design? Like before you go headlong into it and figure out, and assume like, is this the career for me? Can you get the itch scratched by, just going out and having a lovely dinner at an amazingly designed restaurant or going to a boutique hotel that you really love? Like, do you feel like is it that you just want to enjoy beautiful design and be around it and be encompassed by it? Maybe you just want to have like a beautiful home and that's where it goes. I guess for me, yeah, I feel like I get to work with interior designers and be around that world and I get the best of it without having to do all the things that I personally did not love doing, which I know some designers out there are like, oh, I love doing this. I love doing the drawing, or I love, being on site to handle X, Y, and Z, or I love installations. And I was all the things that I was like, oh God, install day, doing the drawings, like all that kind of stuff. Right. So I feel like I get the best of both worlds. And then one thing too that I really love is that because I do still work with interior designers and I know the mindset of interior designers because I am/was one, I know that there are common themes, right? So we tend to be not always type A, but we tend to be highly fastidious, complete perfectionists, all that stuff of like, I don't want to do something unless it's going to be perfect. I don't want to put myself out there unless it's going to be amazing, right?
Yeah.
Like we tend to be so tightly wound when it comes to our performance and the work that we're putting out in the world. And one of the things that I love doing with my clients, aka interior designers, is to say, hey, you can put yourself out there, you can put your voice out there and not worry about it being portfolio perfect, right? Like it doesn't have to be super polished. You can be very authentic. I think in the design industry for a long time, and I think we're coming around to this now, especially, but in a way that I feel like for so long in the design industry, there was a formula. You had to look a certain way, you had to dress a certain way, you had to act a certain way. If it felt inauthentic at all, and I think that's like a whole other thing for me too, is there was a part of me that always felt like it was inauthentic. Now I get to work with clients and help them feel more authentic in their design craft. So that's another way that I get to kind of, like feel like I get to simmer in the pot of interior design without being stuck in it anymore.
Right. Yeah, because you get to help these designers work on their personal brand as well. And I think from approaching it as like a personal brand with you yourself, you've been able to keep basically the name of your company, but you have all these other things that you're doing now. And it's still under, because you're the face of the company, you're the brand. Can you speak a little more about personal branding?
Yeah, absolutely. That's such a good question. When it comes to interior design and a lot of different industries, we don't have to worry so much about personal brand. If you're going to, even if you're not planning on starting your own studio, even if you're thinking like, whoa, I don't want to start my own studio. I just want to work for a studio right now and see how it goes and work myself up in the ranks. Developing a personal brand for yourself, being known for something, even if it's an employee, like you be that employee that is known for X, Y, and Z in your performance, right? And if you're setting up your own studio, there's a reason that because you call your own studio Rebecca Ward Design, right? So you have your own name in there. It's a representation of your personal brand, not just your style and your aesthetic, but what it is that you represent, your philosophy, your goals for your clients. It's how they resonate with you when they're choosing between so many designers out there. So being known for something, having a niche is really important because whether or not we think about it, especially now with this work from home transition and just like not being on site in office anymore, even if you're in a role even if you're an employee, like we have to really think about like, what am I known for? What do I want to be known for?
Yeah.
Like, how do I want to stand apart from the crowd and put my stamp on something and have that niche that no one else has? Or maybe I do a sub niche of something, right? So like maybe you love environmental design. Well, it's no longer enough now to just say like, oh, we do sustainable design. But, maybe you can say, hey, I'm the only designer in, I don't know, Kansas City that does sustainable mid-century modern design, for example, right? And that's your personal brand. It's part of your ethos. So that's where I would say, again, something I think that interior designers, at least maybe when we were going to school and when we first started out, it was very much about like, how do we fit in? How do we do design for everybody? Like if
Right.
someone wants mid-century modern, we'll do that. But if someone wants really, Tuscan traditional, we'll do that too.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the industry is moving now into personal brand, into aspects of like, what do you want to be known for? What is your design niche, both with the aesthetic as well as your personal philosophy?
Yeah, 100%. Because I myself, when I started 15 years ago, did not think about what my own values, my own core values for my company were, even though they say that you should do that. But like, that's the work I've been doing the last few years is figuring out like, who am I? What do I want my company to represent? And how do we work with our clients? And what kind of clients do we want to work with? And all those things. Whereas first starting out is a lot more like how to be corporate almost, to like how to be this
Mhm.
business and do all things for all people and just make the money, but not having the authenticity behind it, which is now the work that we're all doing. And I think it's an interesting shift that I also have been noticing in the last few years.
Absolutely. Yeah, just being brave to say like this is the kind of design I love. This is what I stand for. And and then trusting that you're going to then attract that type of clientele that wants that in turn. And that's another thing that I think a lot of people don't realize is that when sort of put your flag in the ground, as it were, you wind up attracting a type of clientele that really does understand you and wants to work with you. And then you're not, you don't have to worry so much about like, oh, are they going to choose me? Are they, do they want to work with me? And then client relationships wind up being so much better too, I think,
Hmm.
because you've already done that hard work on a level
Hmm.
of vetting your clients and vice versa. So by the
Yeah.
time you then sign that contract with that client, you already have that working relationship before the working relationship has even begun, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah. Really good. So much good advice. Is there anything else that you have for anyone considering a career in interior design as they're starting out?
You know, One thing I would say is just because I decided that interior design was not for me at the end of the day does not mean that I don't think that it's such a wonderful, worthy career. And so if you are at all thinking about it, just, maybe there's a couple different routes, like maybe just to try, right? Maybe try to go get an internship
Hmm.
somewhere at a design studio, see what kind of real world experience you could get. Maybe go to a local community college and take a course in drawing. See how that sits with you. I think sometimes we think that we have to jump headfirst into something.
Hmm.
And maybe that was one of I'm not going to say mistakes because everything I think is a learning experience, but if I look back at myself and how, I would jump into the career and then out of it and then jump back in and then out, maybe, I would have been better served with doing something like that, like first starting out with a design internship if someone would have given
Mm.
me one. And someone will always give you a chance. There's always someone that's going to believe in you and give you a chance. So don't think for a second, I have no experience, I would never get an internship. But yeah, just sort of dip your toes rather than necessarily thinking, I have to save up all this money or have to get this scholarship to do this design degree before you
Hmm.
really even know if it's for you.
Right.
That's something I would say is just, yeah, get your feet wet with it,
Yeah.
dip your toe in the water. And yeah, I mean, look, I love to watch HGTV as much as the next guy, but it's not going to be like that every day. Like anyone who's like, oh, I love to watch these shows. And so I think I want to be a designer. Like, just know that that's like 10% of it.
Yeah.
90% is like the stuff that you don't see on television. And a
Right.
lot of it's paperwork. You know what?
Love it.
You're going to be doing that no matter what you do.
Yeah,
Yeah.
a lot of it is sitting at your desk doing the drawings or doing all the spreadsheets and whatever it is, but you're not just running from job site to job site every day and fluffing pillows. So,
Right. Right. Well, and I love it too because there is obviously, it would depending on how what your work style is. And I used to love like, getting to meet with clients and stuff. But yeah, it's just yeah, the client shopping days are not that's not your 100% reality.
no.
So fun as it is.
Yeah, there's just a small aspect where you get to be a personal shopper, and that's fun. But you got to love all the other things too in order to have it as your career. And so that's really good advice to like kind of get your feet wet and just see if that lights you up and if you should move forward with it. Really good advice. Okay, so before we go, I want to talk a little more about, first of all, your course that I took, which is great for anyone who wants to have a podcast. So you can explain a little bit to our audience what that was about.
Absolutely. Yes. So I have an 8-week concept to completion, zero to launch course called Find Your Voice. It will literally take you from knowing zero about a podcast, because we all start out knowing nothing about a topic, right? And I was no different. It takes you from that on week 1 to actually having your podcast launched by day 2 of week 8. And it's all digital. It's self-study. You just work as you go. So if, let's say, you're a designer already and you're listening to this, like, you don't have to drop everything. You don't have to be a designer. But if you're already working full time and you can't just take the time out to start your pod, you may absolutely work at your own pace. And in fact, I encourage it. The course is really about finding your voice in the respect of not just the technical aspect of launching a podcast, but really finding out what your why is and why it is that you want to show up, what is your message is, who you want to reach, what that niche is, but in terms of, instead of thinking about design aesthetic, thinking about your niche in terms of that brand message and who it is that you are helping. So it's a really holistic course. I like to call it a coaching course as well, because there's so many podcast courses out there now, and a lot of them are just mostly about the technical. And I really like students, or I want students to come away feeling really confident, not just about how to record a show, but what their message is to their listeners, how they're contributing and how they are impacting their listeners out there. So
yeah,
it's a fun 8 weeks.
It
for
is.
sure.
Yeah. And I really loved, I think my favorite part was those intensive days that we did together. We had some time and you just kind of asked me all kinds of questions about myself and what my audience was thinking. And we just really dug deep into it. And that laid such a foundation for me. And you just really excelled at that. Like, you were able to take all the words I was saying and distill it down and be like, okay, this is what you need to do with this, and this is what I'm seeing you say, and all that. It was just great for me. I really think that you gave like 300% to this course as well, because I was overly impressed with the amount of content. Like, the videos are endless, and there's just so much great stuff in there. So it was a wonderful course. So, not to be an advertisement for it, but having experienced it myself, I would definitely recommend it. And so then, besides that, you also have your podcast, and you have a new one. So you have Arrived, and then Arrived Daily recently launched.
It did. Arrive Daily just recently launched. So that's actually a week daily show. So Arrived, the first podcast is it's a seasonal show. And that's a bit more long format, lots of interviews with guests, etc. But Arrive Daily is really about speaking to someone who wants to start a podcast for their business from the framework of giving them, encouraging them, right? Coaching them, helping them to realize what their message is, what their strengths are. Because, kind of going back to what I was talking about earlier, a lot of the clientele that I do work with, right, come out of interior design or even similar careers, we tend to be so focused on the perfect turnout, right? Being polished all the time. And that can really hamper you when you want to start your own show. Because suddenly, for a lot of people, including myself, when I started, it was like, oh my God, I'm pressed record. Now what am I going to say? So Arrive Daily is really all about helping anyone who listens to the show really just develop that trust and that belief in themselves that they can launch their own show and that they can keep showing up for themselves consistently. And you know what? Honestly, it's been such an inspiring journey for me too, because I'm going through this 5 days a week with people. As in, when I say with people, I mean, like, I'm putting that out there, but you're going to hear me. When I started the show, it was like, okay, I'm going to do this Monday to Friday for a year and see how we go. So I'm actually really excited to see how the episode, or how the first episode sounds versus, episode 365, right?
Yeah.
So I'm learning just as much as anyone who's listening, because I want to be a role model for my students and for my listenership as well. We're all learning. I think the day that you think that you can't learn anymore, or that, you're too old to learn, just start over, that's a bad day, right?
Yeah.
So we just, so it's like Arrive Daily is all about just helping people realize that like, hey, you've got a voice. This is how you can use it. And I'm in your court to help you figure that out.
So good. And I can imagine that even though it's geared towards people who want to launch a podcast, a lot of what you're going to be saying in that and what you are saying in that is transferable to other professions and just anything that you're looking to start in your life, just taking that leap. So we'll definitely post the links to the long form and the daily podcast and your course. And where can people find you on socials?
Yeah, so they can find me at Atelier Reed, and that's ATELIERWREDE, Atelier Reed. So that's where I'm at on Instagram for sure. Not so much on Facebook these days. I probably should be, but yeah.
Yeah, designers like to hang out on the Instagrams.
Yeah, for sure.
Are you on TikTok at all yet?
You know what? No, I'm not on TikTok. I have to say, right? So just after saying like, oh, the second you don't think you have anything to learn, I know I have to learn TikTok. But I haven't reached into that just yet. But I wanted to offer something to your listeners, if I may.
Please do.
If you are thinking at all about starting a podcast, I have an amazing quiz, which I think will help you out. It's called What's Your Podcast Personality?
Ooh.
And yeah, so it's all about helping you find out like, what is my podcast personality? What would that mean to start my show given who I am? So if you want to learn what your podcast personality is, you can go to atelierreed.com / whatever the slash is, curious, for Design Curious, because it's special for your listeners.
Awesome. Oh, that sounds fun. I love taking quizzes. So we'll put the link for that in the show notes as well. Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Bethany.
Absolutely. Thank you again for having me, Rebecca. It's been really fun to chat with you and walk down design memory lane for sure.
Yeah. And I just love having your unique perspective of having been a designer and kind of moving out of it, but still having a great experience and great advice for people looking to get into interior design. So thank you for that, Bethany.
Thank you so much.
All right. We'll talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye. So wasn't that really great conversation with Bethany? I love that she had made her course because otherwise I wouldn't be here. And so, definitely go check her out. We have all her links in the show notes, which can be found on my website, rwarddesign.com /podcast. And we'll also include there the link that she has made for us to go take that podcast personality quiz, which sounds really fun. I might just go do it for fun, even after the fact, because I love taking a quiz. I love personality quizzes. Oh my gosh, I need to do a whole podcast about personality types and all the different Enneagrams and Myers-Briggs and Spark type disc assessments. So look for that coming up because you give me a personality quiz, I'm going to take it. So yeah, I'll definitely take her personality quiz. And then I just really loved having her on the podcast because she used to be a practicing interior designer, but now she isn't so much anymore, but she is adjacent to interior design. And I really love getting the perspective of those who have been in the industry and then maybe moved away from it as well, because I wanted to get a very well-rounded view of everyone's different experience with interior design. And coming up next year, I will definitely be including some more alternate views. I'll be talking to instructors at design schools and just try to get a really good variety of designers who have different backgrounds and their approaches to interior design. So stay tuned for that in the new year. And if there's any other topic that you would love for me to cover in Design Curious, go ahead and email me, podcast@rwarddesign.com. That's all for now, Creative One. We'll see you next week on Design Curious Podcast. Thanks for listening. If you love this episode, please leave a rating and a review. This helps me reach other curious creatives like you. If you have a topic request or would like to contact me, simply head over to my website, rwarddesign.com, or email me at podcast@rwarddesign.com.